basically standards, and all the laws, regulations, and this and that, but they're still in the business. So, but it has made people change their perspective about private and public education. But overall, the public education is dominant, and it's the one that always, usually for PISA tests, they pick very few private schools and they mostly pick public schools. And it's a good overview of how the system is actually working.
Yes, that's another perspective on private schools that isn't quite prevalent in Australia, but is certainly a dominant argument in the United States. The idea of having for-profit schools, where schools are set up as businesses with the intent of making money. Um, there's very few, if any, private schools in Australia that have that philosophy. Um, and generally, any money raised is put back into the school. They don't have shareholders and other aspects like that. But in the United States, they are introducing for-profit schools, and that's causing a lot of controversy for many of those same arguments, where if market forces are going to drive decision making, then the best educational outcomes may not be the primary focus of the school. The school may have the best or the main focus being to maximize profits of shareholders. And indeed, under some legal systems, that is their requirement. If they are a commercial company, they have to do things that will maximize their profits. And that's rather an anathema to most educational organizations, and certainly is not a perspective that is supported by any private schools in Australia. But I understand where you're coming from there, Henry. Of course, that is certainly a big issue that's happening in the United States at the moment.
Yeah, and yeah, Colombia tends to look a lot to the American educational system. It tends to draw things from there. Like the No Child Left Behind policy was very popular, and we have a decree with kind of the same underpinning theory that you should fix a lot of things. And it was terrible to the point that the government had to write a new law to override the previous one because we were not getting the results we wanted. The education was going down, and that's when you start realizing that not necessarily every policy will work in your context, no matter how hard you try to adapt it, because the conditions are different, and there are a lot of things that you have to think before doing that.
Now, absolutely, and the one child or no child left behind policy is certainly a good example of that, where it sounds good in theory, where you force schools to ensure that students progress only when they've reached the minimum standards required. But certain circumstances and certain schools, and indeed certain states, where that, because of a whole lot of reasons, not necessarily controllable by the school system, there may be circumstances whereby children are not progressing, and having a child stay in first grade for 12 years is probably not the best educational solution for that child or for that state and system, even though the policy might direct that to occur. So yes, there are issues around having policies that are put in place that are so dogmatic that they can't take into account specific circumstances of difference in large systems. And that's always a problem. And indeed, it may be a problem for your implementation plan, where you come up with an implementation plan that you want to apply to your whole school. And there may be good arguments for, say, the sporting department or the arts department to have exemptions or exceptions to your plan because of their own particular circumstances. And so you may need to consider how your policy is impacting upon the entire community that you would like to see it applied to. Okay, let's keep going through this first document. We seem to be taking a little bit of time on. Okay, so the two models of educational practice: traditional schools and progressive schools. And you can read about the differences between them. The argument has been around since Dewey's time, and generally one focuses on academics and the learning of set content, and the other tends to focus more around the children and the development of the child as a learner, or indeed as a human being, in more progressive aspects. And there's various comparative tables that you can look at. We have a big debate always happening around phonics versus whole language approaches. That tends to be one that's quite common in Australia, which tends to direct things back towards a traditional approach. But also in mathematics, there's a lot of basic math skills that are better supported by a traditional approach than more progressive approaches. Now, whether or not that's because of the content that we've chosen, or whether or not it's actually a fundamental aspect of mathematics education is up for debate, but there are issues around that. And you can explore the various differences between them. Probably one of the most challenging aspects around teacher identity has to relate to the teacher's role. Where in a traditional environment, the teacher is the authority figure and the instructor, and instructs students on what to do and how to achieve their learning. While in a progressive approach, they're redefined as a facilitator and as a mentor, and it's more about helping students achieve the goals that the student set. And the student is generally given the main authority and agency over the learning process. And they are quite dramatically different approaches. Now, many teachers do accommodate both within their teaching and can shift between being an authoritative instructor and being a facilitator and mentor fairly easily with experience, but there are some teachers that have difficulty with that. And then the rest of the paper just goes through a project where they examined the two approaches. And if we look at the conclusions that they made, they found that a variety of approaches were being done in schools, as Henry mentioned before, and generally that variety is considered a fairly good thing, rather than focusing on one particular approach over the other. Okay, any questions, comments about that? Now, Adrian has mentioned something about schools being focused on the arts or sports. Yes, again, that tends to be more of an American problem than an Australian problem, where we have a lot of they have a lot of sporting scholarships because there's a huge amount of money in school-based sport. We don't have anywhere near like the money that is associated with school sport in Australia. But that said, there are schools, both private and state, that have very strong focus areas. We have our rugby schools, we have some public schools, or state schools, that are focused around sporting excellence. Here on the Gold Coast, Palm Beach Currumbin has its own surf clubs and so forth to have a focus on those aspects of sport. We've had some schools, the Currumbin School, a little bit west of Brisbane, was set up basically to teach golf, and for students, particularly from Japan, to come and study here and learn how to play golf. And there are also many schools that are set up around drama and various things like that. Our state system has formalized that into academies, where we have academies for maths and science, we have academies for the arts, and an academy for medicine here on the Gold Coast, where students who've got a particular interest in those particular areas can be selected through an application process to attend those state schools. But in the main, most of our schools in Australia tend to provide a balanced curriculum. There'll always be certain areas of focus, but they're often determined by the staff at the school rather than the philosophy of the school. So any other comments about traditional and progressive education as discussed in the Chandler reading? Okay, let's push on, and hopefully some of you who haven't made many comments about the readings this evening can find some ways to contribute. Okay, just making sure our recording's still going ahead. Yep, looks like it is. Okay, the next one by Coe and Alosi and so forth is looking at teaching and what the research has told us about what makes effective teaching, or in their terminology, great teaching. And they've identified a number of factors. So this is the summary section. They looked at the question and they came up with these 6 elements. The teacher's pedagogy knowledge, or pedagogical content knowledge. So having a good understanding of what they were teaching and how to teach that, and identifying students' misconceptions and being able to address those misconceptions. Whereby teachers that didn't have a good understanding of what they were teaching might even reinforce misconceptions, indeed teach things wrong. So teaching mathematical concepts incorrectly or scientific concepts incorrectly, and that obviously would have an impact upon students' learning because they're learning the wrong thing. The quality of their instruction was the next one, whereby how teachers go about teaching and making sure that they allow enough time for students to learn and that scaffolding their learning and developing a learning process that supports students' learning. So they were seen as the 2 most strong evidence on student learning outcomes. Then we had some moderate evidences, the classroom climate in terms of the culture that is established in a classroom, how academic they are, how engaged they are with the learning, how much agency and self-worth the students have, feeling that they are capable of learning new material. And we have a term for a lot of that now called a growth mindset. So having the idea that you're not trapped in any predetermined capability, that you can always learn how to learn. Classroom management was also identified as of moderate impact. So being able to actually manage and coordinate a classroom, look after behaviour, use the time available effectively, things of that nature. And a couple that had fairly minimal impact. Teachers' beliefs and what the teacher sort of thought was important around the role of teaching, their philosophy of teaching, things of that nature. And aspects of professional behaviour by teachers. So how often they were on time, followed through with their consequences, communicated with parents, all of those managerial aspects and professional behaviours. So that was the findings. The rest goes through some aspects of how they went about achieving those findings and clarifying them. And then the document goes through in more detail about all the different issues that they looked at. So, what do we think about that reading?
Well, I'm gonna start.
Thank you, Henry.
This is very interesting because from my particular experience, my bachelor degree is not in education. So like when I started working as a teacher, one of the conditions I had to fulfill for the Colombian government was to get a degree or a title in education. Um, so, well, I did, it was like a 480-hour workshop that they gave you the basics of how to teach, blah, blah, blah. And I already had experience of 7 years in teaching. But when I got to the school system, and usually they always ask it, this is very important in Colombia, like, what's your title? What's your university degree? And when I would say that my degree was in philosophy and I was not, usually teachers have a previous part in their title that says licensed teacher or licensed in this certain area. For them was a shock. It was like, you're not supposed to be a teacher. But what was worse is the fact that my performance assessments, when other peers were reviewing the structure of my classes and this and that, they said actually that they were shocked that I was very good at it. And I said, well, it's because I know and I have understood that you need to have a philosophy and you need to have an approach to teach something. It does not necessarily mean that if you have a title, you know how to do it, because you learn this is from experience, because you learn a lot of theory. But then when you get to the classroom, you face something completely different. So when you read all the list of these things, that's something that, like, how did I manage to do this? I remember once someone told me, well, for someone that doesn't have any training in teaching, you're a good teacher. And I was like, I didn't know if it was a compliment or I took it as a compliment, but it was like pointing that you need to actually do something in education to understand education, and sometimes you just need some practice. It sounds like it was a bad experiment that actually didn't go wrong, that actually went in the right way. But from my experience, what I get is that most teachers are focused mostly on content, and most of my peers back home, so they are very good. You know, they know a lot about the content they teach. They're very good in chemistry or physics or math, but they are terrible at communicating that knowledge to students. And I think that's one of the biggest factors you have to consider sometimes. Like, it's good that you know a lot, you have the content knowledge, but if you don't know how to transmit that to others, basically you are not helping at all in education. So I guess that happens when the systems that are more Colombian educational system is working now into the professionalization of education. So teachers are required to do a lot more than just an undergrad in education, or they have to complete certain requirements. But at one time, it was like it was just because you had the title, and it was a very common practice back in Colombia too, until I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years ago, that you would become a teacher, and teacher would be just a way for you to pay for a better degree. And that was the conception for a better degree. So being a teacher was considered a menial job. So he's like, this is, I mean, there's a lot of things here that get in place that and start, connecting things. Like, what makes you a good teacher? Actually having a degree in education, having the knowledge, or actually having the vocation. Sometimes people just were born to be teachers. So it's an interesting debate.
Now, absolutely. And um, that debate happens in every country. In Australia, we have a 4-year Bachelor of Teaching pathway, and we have a pathway where you, up until very recently, you did 1 year add on to a previous degree. They've just made it 2 years, quite this year, to expand that out. But the very same arguments have long been held. And indeed, there are quite a growing number of organizations and people arguing that teachers who do a degree previously in something other than teaching and then do the add on um, master's or diploma approach tend to be better teachers. The Melbourne University has that as their only pathway into education, and they're very strong advocates of that approach. So there are certainly alternatives to doing an education degree. Um, and sometimes the difficulty with an education degree is that the students involved have come straight out of school and have gone straight into a 4-year environment whereby they're not necessarily seeing the content that they're going to be teaching outside of the context of education. And it can often be quite insular. And that's one of our big arguments against maths education in schools. Maths education in schools tends to be very much focused on the needs of education rather than the needs of the real world. And indeed, what mathematicians do has got very little to do with what maths education is in schools. Similarly for science. Scientists now do things very, very differently to how science is taught in schools. Because if you just are within a closed ecosystem, you only reinforce the things that you already know about within that ecosystem. You're not looking outside the ecosystem and bringing in what's happening elsewhere. So it's quite a common problem and a common issue in education, having people come from professions and fit within the schooling systems. So I'm just looking at some of the comments. Not only school teachers, some lecturers who hold PhDs are bad in delivering knowledge to. Connie, you would be surprised. Almost no university academics have any training whatsoever in teaching. The only ones that do are those that come from the School of Education. There is a move to try to change that and to provide courses and processes whereby university academics will learn how to teach, but it's incredibly rare. Unfortunately, that provides a number of consequences in that most other academics and professions don't value teaching particularly highly because they've never studied it. They've never understood what high quality teaching can be, and they've always had to make it up on their own. And so they sort of feel that it's just something that can be made up on its own. So it's a little bit of a problem in our higher education system overall, the lack of understanding we have around teaching. Because primarily academics are focused on their research. Teaching is something that academics do because they have to, so that they're allowed to do their research. And if they can get out of teaching and just be purely research focused, they will do so. So that's been identified as a problem because one of the purposes of universities is to provide the transmission of knowledge to our society and to educate, but it's a huge cultural shift to try to achieve that. Now, Adrian also mentions, I find I'm a better facilitator than a teacher. I get carried away with the content, teaching, and come across as boring to the students. But when I shift to the focus on the students, their receptiveness and their interest in the learning outcomes is far better. Absolutely, Adrian. And that's always the issue. Sometimes you've got a group of students who are purely interested in the content, and that's fine if they're really self-motivated and just want a teacher or an academic or whoever to provide them with lots of good information and so forth. But in the main, most students are not that interested in the content that they're learning. They're learning because they have to, because they feel that it's part of an overall strategy to get employment or to achieve other things. And they would much prefer it to be an engaging experience and have the teacher focus on supporting them in that journey. And that's again a good counterpoint between traditionalist and progressive approaches, where in the progressive approaches we're much more about meeting the needs of the students and helping them want to learn and want to engage with the learning process, whereby in traditionalist approaches we want to make the students learn and we want to try to have them achieve the highest possible academic outcome, even though they may not necessarily want that. But that's the focus and the intent of the traditionalist educational model, which can be good. You can get much better test scores and all the rest. And long term, that may be beneficial to the students. Of course, we also need to understand that students, by their very nature, are immature. They can't necessarily make long-term rational decisions. So the argument from the traditional side is that by having adults make those decisions for them and push them into an academic pathway and push them to excel, that in the long term that they'll be grateful for that when they reach a level of maturity to understand the benefits of having done so. But that's not always the perspective that students have, and unfortunately too many students drop out of the system when they're pushed into that sort of approach. So it's fine for those that make it through that traditional approach, but lots of them fall out of the system, and that becomes a problem. And that's where the more progressive approaches that are focused on encouraging students and engaging them and keeping them in the learning process by meeting their needs has been successful. So they both are different approaches. They both have advantages and disadvantages. And yes, Hadis, it can depend upon the level. And certainly, well, even at the early childhood levels, sometimes we can push students to achieve dogmatically and that will work with them. But other times that it may just disengage them and they may learn to dislike a subject. We have a big problem with that in mathematics, where a lot of students, through their early experiences with mathematics, disengage with the learning of mathematics quite early on and can never then really catch up because they've had a bad experience of being made to learn things that they're not particularly interested in. So lots of different counterpoints between those two approaches. Any other things before we move on to the next reading? Okay, so the next reading, Henry mentions there's a lot of research on student retention in the first years. And yes, university experiences also face the same issues, where it's a big culture shock going from schools to universities. And indeed, we have one of our biggest culture shocks coming from private school students and very high-performing private school students, because they come from an environment where they're very strongly supportive in schools, where every possible measure is put into place with tutors and supportive networks to help them in their learning, and they are very successful within those networks. But then they come to university where those networks no longer exist, and they are forced to then survive on their own abilities. And indeed, we find that most well-performing students from state schools tend to perform much better at university, at least initially, because they've been used to having to cope with their own learning. That despite the challenges of a state school system, they've overcome those and they've become self-reliant learners. And so coming to a university, that's fine, because that's what universities are designed to sort of sponsor and support. But that said, universities have realized that this is a problem now, and we're putting more efforts into providing support structures for the first year experience, whereby we have tutors that will guide them through and mentors that will look after them and identify when they're having difficulties. And some of our learning analytics are around trying to identify students that are going to have difficulties and providing that extra support because they've been used to that in their schooling system prior to university. Okay, the next reading is on Dewey, which you'll find on the course website. And it is just an extract where Dewey wrote about the differences between traditional and progressive education back when he was first experiencing this. Now, at the time, he was wanting to have to provide students with learning experiences related to the real world, such as running their own shops or doing woodworking and metalworking and things like that, and was coming up with the arguments from the traditionalists who wanted to have the students stay in their classrooms, sitting in their roads, learning things by rote. So that's sort of the extremes. We've taken things a lot more in the argument since then, but at the time, education was very rigid. Students generally didn't speak out of turn. They did their lessons and were punished if they were disobedient or weren't focused on their lessons, and education went through in that sort of rigorous way. Dewey, however, wanted to introduce a whole lot of more progressive approaches, such as projects and work, going on excursions and doing things outside the classroom, and had a lot of opposition from traditionalists in the school systems. But a lot of teachers saw the advantages and the benefits that could be achieved by doing things differently to the very rigorous approaches, and particularly in the 60s when a whole lot of approaches to society that were much more liberal and free thinking were on the rise. The progressive approach to education was embraced by a lot of new educators coming into the system at that time. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments about Dewey's article? Adrian, yes, it was in the US context, but it certainly also occurred fairly much in parallel in the United Kingdom and in Australia and in other Western countries. I'm not so sure about European countries. I know it certainly had some influence in the Scandinavian countries. I don't believe it had as much of an influence in France and Germany because they have somewhat different systems, and I can't really speak to the other countries in Europe. But certainly Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, etc., all had a similar experience at the time. Of course, there was fairly much a social shift occurring where society was engaging with knowledge and authority very differently to how it had previously. There's a lot of sociological reasons around that, primarily coming out of a world war, going through a very traditionalist approach in the 50s, where things went back to a very regimented sort of way of thinking about many things. And we also had women's liberation occur at that time, other liberation movements, and a whole lot of very different ways of approaching the world. And yes, the whole post-industrialization aspect, but a lot of big agendas were occurring in society at that time. And so they had an impact upon education. And progressive education was sort of the result of many of those new ways of thinking. But progressive education in terms of theory had been around for quite a bit earlier. A number of educational philosophers and thinkers had introduced concepts around that, but they hadn't necessarily been well explored in our major education systems. Yes, the whole postmodern movement had a big influence on many of these different aspects, although how much the societal movements had an influence on postmodernism is also sort of up for debate. But it was certainly quite a different environment than what we see today. Today we see probably much more of a return to a traditionalist perspective as our main sort of societal viewpoints, but we've got a lot of other legacy aspects of postmodernism that are influencing many decision-making processes as well. But that goes a bit beyond what we're going to explore in the context of our readings this evening. Okay, any other comments about Dewey? Okay, we'll go ahead then and look at some of the more recent readings. Whoops, done that one. Oh, I've missed one. Oh, sorry, I've misordered our readings. So yes, we need to go back and have a look at the science of learning. So this one again looks at some of the elements of cognitive theory that have been emerging in recent years and how they support these two approaches or provide an alternative to the two approaches of progressive and traditional education. So some of the things here is around how we understand ideas and what we've learnt from cognitive science about how learning occurs in the brain, and how the idea that we need to map ideas, and this fits in well with constructivist theory, which is considered a more progressive approach, but it can also relate to some of the more traditional approaches, particularly around repetition and rote learning and reinforcement of concepts by strengthening neural pathways by repeating some learning many times, which is certainly not a progressive approach. It's sort of much more of a traditional approach. So cognitive science is providing elements that support both approaches. And there's just various elements in there about different ways of engaging with that. The implications in a classroom around how students can be asked questions and focus on tasks and get their attention on various elements. And try to provide meaningful context so that students will associate their learning with already established context that they've learnt. And the whole idea that from a cognitive perspective is that all learning has to be associative. We can't learn something completely new that isn't related to something else because we've got no processes within our brain to link the neural pathways together. So in order to provide a neuron that links to an existing neuronal structure in our brain, we have to have some context so that that neuron can relate to that context that already exists in the brain. And this also explains why sometimes we learn the same thing in different contexts. The most common thing is in learning about vectors. You may learn about vectors in physics, you may learn about vectors in mathematics, and the concept of vectors is exactly the same in both contexts. But often students will learn about them in physics class and associate all of those memories about vectors with their previously existing concepts around physics. And they may also then come to use vectors in mathematics. And even though they know about vectors in the context of physics, they can't apply them in the context of mathematics because there's no associated linkages between those concepts. And indeed, they may have to relearn them or may relearn them in the mathematics concepts and build another entire conceptual understanding of vectors in a mathematics context, completely separate to the actual concepts that they've developed in a physics context. And then at some stage, they've got to reconcile those two understandings, and it gets quite complex for them to do so. So the whole idea around cognition in education and how memory is formed is quite a complex one, but has some fundamental issues that can explain some areas of education that we've had trouble with explaining in the past, particularly around how some students have got difficulty transferring their learning to a new context. How students solve problems, some various aspects there that they've raised, and that how long-term memory can aid problem solving, because if we have to draw upon our working memory and put anything we want to do in working memory, then that limits what we can achieve in problem solving. But if it's already existing in long-term memory, then we just have to bring the link to it into our short-term memory. And we can then have a lot more complexity in what we're trying to understand. And generally it's been experimentally identified that we can hold about 8 to 10 things in our short-term memory at any one time. And if all of those things are being used up in very simple elements that we have to remember, such as various names. Say if we're doing something around climate science, if we have to be remembering how clouds work and how evaporation works and how a whole range of other things work in great detail, that very quickly uses up our short-term memory. But if we've already gained a good understanding of how the weather systems and water cycle works, and that's in our long-term memory, then that might only take up 1 bit of our 10 areas of short-term memory. And so then we've got 9 other areas to introduce new concepts and relate them to the weather cycle. So just various elements around that and so forth. This one is around the transfer of knowledge, which I sort of talked about. That if we've already established our concepts in other contexts, that can be difficult. The other element relates to constructivism, where a lot of people misinterpret the idea of constructivism around constructing knowledge. One of the key aspects of constructivism is actually identifying students' existing understanding of a concept and identifying if it is correct or not. And if it's incorrect, we have to actually deconstruct that knowledge and convince students that their understanding is incorrect. And that's actually a very difficult thing to do. But it's essential if we want to then be able to build a new understanding of a concept. Because if we have to try to build it on an already incorrect understanding, then we can compound the problem and make it a very complicated understanding where we've got elements that are incorrect and correct in the same understanding. And we see that in common examples in science, such as around students' understanding of why the seasons occur. So, there's a good question here. Why does it get colder in winter? Type your answer in and we'll see if you understand the concept. Why is it cold in winter? And we'll see who's still here listening. Yep, the sun being further away from the earth. The sun is further away from the earth. Of course, the nights are longer, there's less sun radiation. Okay, they're all logical solutions and all incorrect. And indeed, you've been taught the correct answer at least 4 or 5 times during your schooling. But because our first understanding of heat is developed when we're very early, when we're very young, we may get close to a heater, and we can see that if we get close to the heater, it gets hotter. And if we move away from the heater, it gets colder. But your understanding that you developed as a very young child has never been deconstructed. And when you learnt about the sun, you built upon that understanding. But the reason that it gets hotter and colder is actually to do with the tilt of the earth and the fact that because we're tilted towards the sun, there's more surface area for the sun to collect heat. And when we're tilted away from the sun in winter, there's less surface area for the sun to absorb heat. And that's why the seasons are hot or cold. It's all to do with the tilt of the earth. We do actually get closer to the sun a tiny bit, but it has a negligible effect on the amount of heat that we receive from the sun. So another example, though, is often around, let's say, the growth of trees. You've all seen trees in the environment. Trees start off as little seedlings, and then they grow up into huge, big trees. How does that happen? Where does the mass of that tree come from? How does a tree go from a little sapling into a giant, big tree? Where does the tree come from? So type your answer in. Photosynthesis, cell reproduction. This is what I'm teaching in kindergarten. Good. Hopefully you're teaching it correctly. So, Hadis, if you're teaching it in kindergarten, what are you teaching them? What's the answer?
Actually, it will start with like bringing some beans and a little plate for them and asking them to like have an experience to like growing a seed. And after that, they will asking about how they grown up and something like that. And then we will talking about photosynthesis and these things. So one of my problem at kindergarten was like, if you are teaching the photosynthesis and the season, you should like talking about winter, and after that talking about spring, because sometimes they think that if it's more, we have to talking about more deeply in this case. It is like after a long seasoning of winter, there is also a spring, and the nature are like getting birth again. And because sometimes children are getting depression when they are not aware of the seasonal things. So they need to learn everything next to each other. Now I'm like really excited about the topic in our class, and it's like actually takes a long time and a lot of work in our classroom to teach like a little photosynthesis things in our class. You know what I mean?
Yep.
We should be careful, each student, what they knew before the class and from outside from their parents, and what they are like need to know in our classroom. So it's a little difficult to like explain it in like one sentences, because we need to show them some video about it, some picture about it, asking question. We need to be aware of what they learned from TV and something like that. And then after that, we should make a discussion and teach them during like doing activities, telling stories, or maybe like do some handcrafts.
All very good progressive approaches, and certainly age appropriate at that level. But let's get back to this question of where this tree comes from, because it actually has a big impact upon our understanding of issues around climate science at the moment, and some of the reasons why a lot of climate deniers are able to put forward their ideas because they haven't understand these basic concepts. So the idea of the tree coming out of the soil is a bit of a problem, because as a tree grows up, there'd be a huge hole appear beneath it as it drew all the material out of the soil. So that's probably not where it comes from. It actually comes from the air, and it's all to do with carbon. Trees are mostly made of carbon, and it gets it all out of the air, and that's how it is actually grown and built as an entity. And it's one of the big issues around climate change at the moment, because we're putting actually a lot more carbon into the air, and it's changing our climate, it's changing how much temperature in terms of the sun being able to hit the earth because of this extra carbon in the air, because it's no longer trapped in plants and trees, where we used to have a lot less carbon in the air because it was all part of our trees. But it's just another example of where we have misconceptions about fairly fundamental things in science and in nature. And you're not alone in these misconceptions. I use these examples because they're very common misconceptions. We don't teach them at all well in schools. Or correctly, we do teach them well, but students have already built up previous ideas about where things come from. And the idea of things coming out of the air is just not intuitive for us. And so we reject that as our concept. And even though we're taught the right way, we don't build the concepts in our brains in that way, because we've already developed preconceived ideas of how things are constructed. But we're diverging a little bit from our readings. A little bit to do with association and cognitive bias, but much more to do with constructivist approaches, whereby we have to deconstruct existing knowledge in order to build new knowledge. And very rarely do teachers actually go through that process, but it can have a fundamental impact upon student learning. Generally, teachers assume that what you're teaching them the students don't already have a pre-existing idea about it, and that they're going to learn your new knowledge without really any association with existing knowledge. That cognitive science teaches us that that's completely incorrect, and that all learning builds upon existing knowledge, and that if that existing knowledge is going to override the new knowledge, because it presents a conflicting perspective, then the new knowledge is probably going to be rejected unless we can have a very strong argument given to students as to why it's incorrect and why the new knowledge should be adopted. Okay, back to the readings. So the final aspects here are beliefs about intelligence. This is an area that's very popular in schools at the moment around the idea of a growth mindset. There was a time whereby we thought everyone had a specific IQ. They still have an IQ, but it can change over time. It may not change a huge amount, but the fact that it can change can be very, very important for students' perspective. If they get the idea that they are bad at maths at an early age, then that idea may stay with them for the entire life. Or if they're not particularly smart, then they will learn to that expectation. And there's been lots of experiments done where we encourage students and give them the idea that they are intelligent, and they will rise to that expectation. That said, however, traditionalists can often argue against that approach in that it sets up false expectations, and the idea of giving every student certificates and every child succeeding all the time has been highlighted as a negative from many in the traditionalist camp, who argue that students need to learn that they have to put an awful lot of hard work into achieving excellence. And the idea that everyone can achieve excellence is problematic in that it devalues the pursuit of excellence. And a whole lot of arguments around that aspect. So various aspects that you can read into, and this also highlights some of the misconceptions around brain science. The idea that there are learning styles has generally been debunked. That we only use 10% of our brains is completely incorrect. We always use 100%. That people are preferentially right-brained or left-brained is generally also incorrect. We use both sides of our brains, and indeed both sides of our brains are very much interlinked. There are certainly people that have had injuries to their brains where they've only been able to use certain aspects, and then they may be able to do certain things that have been coded in different parts of the brain, and they often then may have to relearn how to do things if part of their brain that had that aspect coded into their brain has been destroyed. But it's not an ingrained aspect of being creative or rational being located in one hemisphere of the brain. So a few things there around cognitive science that is important to think about when we're considering traditional and progressive approaches to education, because when those concepts were first developed, we didn't really have an understanding of cognitive principles and cognitive aspects of education. But that's all come about in the last 20 years and is having slowly an impact upon how we understand learning and the educational processes. So, any comments about cognition? Yes, brain plasticity is certainly a common term used around that, where once upon a time it was assumed that how our brain developed up until we reached a certain age, and then the brain stopped developing. We now know that the brain continues to develop throughout our lifetime. There are certain times, particularly in adolescence and in early childhood, where we have a process called brain pruning, where we go through a process where a whole lot of linkages between elements in the brain are removed, so that we can then allow new links to occur, and the existing links then become strengthened. The main reason we've theorized that that occurs is so that students or children can associate lots of ideas when they're very young, But over time, we don't necessarily want that free association. We want to have certain capacities, such as being able to throw a spear or to find things or hear certain concepts or identify plants, that are reinforced and strengthened. And the pruning processes occur in the brain to allow us to do that. Okay, the concept of multiple intelligences. How they're defined by Howard Gardner, yes, I do believe in. How they've been misinterpreted by a lot of people to put forward to teachers different ways of differentiating students based upon particular strengths and weaknesses has been shown to be incorrect. Howard Gardner was identifying different things that we have as important in intelligence. So the idea that there wasn't purely one measure of intelligence, such as spatial reasoning or mathematical reasoning, which make up a lot of our IQ tests. That the fact there was a whole range of things that were important in intelligence. That I certainly agree with. But how that was misinterpreted by a lot of people to provide differentiation so that certain students should be better taught based upon various approaches to intelligence has caused a lot of problems. So I hope that's answered your question, Hadis. But yes, so there are certain elements of the fundamental theory behind multiple intelligences that certainly do hold up, but there are lots of aspects that it's been applied and interpreted in different ways by generally non-academics and non-scientists that have resulted in a lot of distorted approaches to multiple intelligences. So any other aspects of cognition? Henry jokes with his students that when they show progress, I tell them, well, you've just made a synapse and hopefully for life. Now, absolutely. And the whole idea of understanding that learning is a process of creating synapses or strengthening synapses between concepts is a very different way of understanding education to what we've done traditionally in the past. But it does flow out into many of our theories that we've developed independently of cognition and explain why some things work and some things don't work in those theories. And it's also a nice way of linking behaviorist theories and instructivist theories and constructivist theories, where in the past they've been seen as quite independent of each other. Okay, let's look at our final reading. So this is looking at the work of John Hattie, who has put forward a range of ideas around different approaches to education and done some meta studies, looking at lots of different studies and ranked these approaches and put forward the idea that some approaches should be adopted in schools and some approaches shouldn't be adopted in schools based upon this collection of meta studies that he's undertaken. It's become very popular in many schools, and a lot of school systems and schools are undertaking to use this research to allow teachers to focus on particular approaches that, from Hattie's research, suggest will provide a more successful learning outcome for students. There has, however, been a lot of criticism of John Hattie's work, and particularly his research methodologies and some of the conclusions that he's made, but that should be taken from both perspectives though. Academically, his work does have a lot of holes in it. But that said, his work has found resonance with a lot of teachers and principals. So the fact that it's not been academically verified doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. But conversely, a lot of his arguments are based upon previous academic studies. So the fact that it may work is also counterpointed from the fact that it's quite hypocritical in many respects for him to base a lot of his conclusions upon research when his own research is open to a lot of question. So the reason I include it though in your readings is because it is having a lot of influence on school decision making at the moment. So whether or not it's academically valid or not, it's still having an impact upon education. Much as we saw learning styles having a major impact upon education, even though they were, or eventually decided upon, being quite invalid as an approach in how they've been implemented. Now this paper goes through and highlights some of the things that Hattie has identified. The fact that students account for the vast majority of variance in achievement. That's a bit problematic in that it says that the teachers can't actually influence things as much as we once thought we could. And the actual capacity of our students and their environment, how they've been raised, and a whole lot of other things has got a lot of impact upon what can be achieved with students, such as the home environment, which accounts for another 10%, the school environment, whether or not it's a small class size or well-financed school, has a relatively small effect. The principal, in terms of the leadership of the school, has an effect. Their peer group has another effect, around about 5 to 10%. And teachers, who we once considered to have a major effect on student learning, only really account for about 30% of the differences in terms of student learning. But that said, it is still an effect that we can influence. We can't necessarily influence the students. We can't necessarily influence the home environment. And sometimes we can't necessarily influence the school environment, or even our principal. But we can influence what we can. And so even though that 30% is relatively small, it's still an important effect if that is what we can make a change to. And so Hattie claims he's looked at 500,000 studies and looked at all the different factors and made a huge listing here about the things that we can influence and whether or not they're related to students or teachers. So the main one he's found is that feedback is the most important influence on student achievement. How much feedback students are provided in terms of their progress and that they can act on that feedback and make changes is the major factor in terms of education or school education. Other things are instructional quality, particularly as Hattie relates it to more traditional approaches to instruction and education. The use of direct instruction. So again, you see a focus on more traditional approaches to teaching and learning. Remediation and more feedback is another one. The class environment, the challenging aspect of goals, and so forth. What he finds is having less impact are things such as team teaching, project-based learning, where's that here? Behaviorism, and things of that nature. So a lot of progressive educators take offense at the devaluing of their approaches to education. And one of the arguments that is raised is that the measures of effect that have been identified in the studies have been primarily around things that can be measured on tests of understanding, whereby a lot of progressive education learning outcomes are not particularly measurable on tests of understanding, such as project-based learning and all the soft skills associated with that, student engagement with the learning process, and things of that nature. But Hattie does make some interesting contributions around identifying the differences between expert and experienced teachers and how teachers progress in their capacity to influence student learning, and goes through a range of different approaches that he puts into place there. And I'll leave you to read those aspects and return to your questions. So what do you think of Hattie's particular approach and explanation about how schools can improve by leveraging the identifiable measures that have been associated through his studies, or his examination of studies, and identified as most impactful upon student learning, particularly as they relate to their achievement on externally measurable learning outcomes? So Adrian mentions the limited dimensions of effect size for sure. Yes, there are limitations upon effect size, but if you think about things in terms of entire systems or even entire schools, if you put in place these sorts of changes, then if they're effective, they can have a significant effect upon the whole cohort of students in terms of their learning. So while they certainly may not work for every student in every circumstances, if systems apply these approaches and they do have measurable effects as suggested, then we could see quite measurable changes for the better in student learning over all the students in a state or all the students in a country, for example. Other thoughts? So we've raised a number of fairly controversial dichotomies this evening because progressive and traditional education have had a long history of being somewhat opposed to each other. As was pointed out in the beginning, teachers in the classroom accommodate both and also are now starting to accommodate cognitive theory because teachers are much more flexible than researchers and advocates for these various approaches. But that said, they all seem to have some advantages and disadvantages. I'm quite interested in cognitive approaches because they tend to provide a link between more traditional approaches and progressive approaches. But there's also the whole aspect around behaviorism and constructivism and a whole lot of other theories that are emerging that relate to these areas. Now, Adrian asks, how do we measure mixed or combined dimensions of expert and experienced? Yes, Adrian, it does become much more complicated when we mix our measurable elements. But the idea is generally that we want to see teachers progress from experienced to expert and to highlight what the expert teachers are doing so that experienced teachers can adopt similar measures. And yes, if you do come up with some good solutions to this, there'll be rejoicing in the streets and the classrooms throughout the world. But I suspect very strongly that it's not a simple solution. Otherwise, someone would have come across it beforehand. Education is a very complex process because we work with human beings. And human beings are incredibly complex and complicated in how they approach everything we do. And it's very difficult to lock down what's done in that respect. We do have educational psychology and lots of things like that to try to understand these processes. But when we start taking what we've learned from educational psychology and try to apply that to large groups, as we find in classrooms and in schools, it gets even more complicated. So what might work for an individual in a very discrete environment that we can control may not necessarily work in a more complicated environment of the classroom and certainly of the school and of the society. Okay, So I think we'll start drawing things to a close then. Hopefully this evening you've seen some different approaches that you can consider when you are thinking about your implementation plans, because you're going to most likely have some people pushing various perspectives from either a traditional perspective or a progressive perspective or even a cognitivist perspective in your stakeholders, be they parents, students, teachers, principals, leadership, etc. And generally it'll probably be a combined mix of those. So you're going to have to accommodate the interests and needs of progressives as well as the interests and needs of traditionalists in your approach to introducing a new educational technology. And next week we're going to make things a little bit more complicated even still and look at some of the more emerging educational models that have gone beyond just the traditionalist and cognitivist and progressive perspectives of the last 20 or 30 years. And there's a whole lot of new things that are emerging that we should at least consider, even though the bulk of our stakeholders will be focused around the traditionalist and progressive approaches. So any final comments, questions, or statements that you'd like to make before we finish up? Okay then. Well, we'll finish up this evening and I'll see you back again next week. But don't forget to get started on your assignment and start working through those aspects that you can already start conceiving about and thinking about. And then as we finish up the last 2 weeks, things will hopefully refine themselves a little bit more and you'll be able to finalize for when it's due in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, good night all.